I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Gus Chikala, the President and CEO of Project Assistance. Gus founded Project Assistance in 1996 with the goal of transforming our clients' approach to portfolio and project management to achieve a standard of excellence in execution that consistently delivers expected project outcomes. A recognized portfolio and project management expert, Gus is a published author of many popular books and articles on the subject of project management, and he frequently presents and teaches topics of interest around project and portfolio management. Gus?
Thank you, Jan, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending. I think we might have a few folks in Europe, so good evening to you as well. For today's presentation, I'd like to present first our agenda. And so I'll introduce the topic, followed by a discussion of the challenges that we typically see around this whole idea of project management maturity assessment and improvement. We'll then follow that up with a brief flyby of some of the project management maturity assessment methodologies and related content that's available in the world today. And we'll talk about the what now, the actual title of the presentation, what now, what I call the project. We'll follow that with, as Jan suggested, some questions and answers. So the first thing I'd like to talk about are some of the challenges we run into with project management maturity assessments. Not so much the challenges in the organization that caused the assessment to happen. They're your typical challenges around projects not completing on time and resource bandwidth challenges and a desire for executive management to have early warning systems. We're not talking about those kinds of challenges. We're going to assume that those challenges are real, that there's a very legitimate reason why an organization will want to assess its maturity and why it would want to improve that. So what we're going to really talk about are the challenges that make project management maturity assessment and improvement initiatives challenging. The first one I'd like to talk about is the PMO mission and vision. As many of you know, in many organizations these days, the mission and vision of project management itself is oftentimes centered in something like a project management office, a program management office, a portfolio management office, some central role which really owns the mission and vision for the organization. And oftentimes, I would say in our experience, more than half have some challenges with the clarity of the mission and vision of that organization. And so that when a project management maturity assessment is kicked off, there can be lots of challenges around, well, why are we doing this? And why is the PMO, what's their authority, for example? The other challenge we see with a lack of clarity is the scope definition itself. While we see challenges in organizations that want to do project management well, one of the challenges we see is scope definition. It's quite interesting that that same challenge emerges as we see organizations embark on initiatives to improve project management maturity. The idea that this is a project that needs to be scoped can be a pretty significant challenge. The third challenge I want to mention here is the lack of ability to measure a current state. So with the assumption that project management assessments at some point lead to some desire to improve project management, the question of how do we know if we improved or not really has a basic assumption that there would be some current state available to create a baseline for improvement. I often use the analogy of, going on a diet. And if we go on a diet and we don't jump on the scale before we embark on that diet, it's difficult for us to answer a simple question like, how much weight did you lose? Or, hey, you look great, you look like you lost a lot of weight. What percentage of your body mass, your doctor might ask you, has come off? Hopefully your doctor would measure something like that. But it's a lot more challenging in the world of project management because if you think about it, if an organization had an ability to measure things like the average duration of a certain kind of project or the average cost or the average resource requirements, capacity in order to complete that project, if an organization was good at those things, a lot of the project management challenges that we see out there wouldn't exist. So it's a real problem to think about taking measurements that now enable us to know what the state of improvement is as these initiatives hopefully succeed. The other challenge we want to talk about is the organization itself. So a lot of organizations that are trying to get good at project management have some level of dysfunction. So one of the things that's out there is unclear expectations. A lot of project management organizations, PMOs, are brought into the world with a target on their back. And so the unclear expectations have a lot to do with what are we really expecting from the PMO? What is it that we want them to do and when? The other thing that happens is, while there may be expectations out there, very often they're misaligned. They vary. They're all over the board in terms of what we want the PMO to do. And typically, those variations can be so broad that when put together, the expectation is perfection, right? So if we're not careful, these improvement initiatives really are born into a very impatient audience, an audience that's really expecting things to go extremely well in a very short amount of time. Unmeasurable expectations. So the other one we see here is that the expectations are very qualitative. We want things to get better. We want things to improve. We want our costs to go down. We want our project managers to be more effective. And while they're all valid statements, the reality is to not do something that's measurable, it creates a significant challenge. So when we look at why is an organization doing this, oftentimes we'll hear some very qualitative statements around the whys of the organization. Sponsorship is unclear. So a lot of organizations want to get better at project management, but in terms of who actually owns that challenge can be very fleeting, very unclear, very much shared, and oftentimes unstated. A lack of commitment to project management investment is another large organizational challenge that we see. And this really comes in the form of we want to get better at project management, but we don't feel like that should cost us a whole lot more money. We feel like we have an investment in project management. We have project managers. We have time put aside in our projects to do project management well. Why does there need to be an investment in this infrastructure? It's sort of like saying we want cars to go fast down the highway, but we don't want to create on-ramps to the highways. And that is a very valid concern from a lot of organizations and can create significant challenges for these improvement initiatives. And again, not only the unclear expectations, but very, very close to unclear expectations and misaligned expectations is this idea of unrealistic expectations. When I said that the expectations can be varied and they can run across a broad range, when we add those things together, oftentimes what we get is something that's just unrealistic for an organization to accomplish. And why is that the case? Well, especially in today's world, what we've been through for the past now 3 years, plus or minus 3 years, with this recession, this global recession we've been going through and that we hopefully are coming out of now, there was a lot of, not only were projects canceled, but obviously without a lot of projects, this idea of having a project management office, of having tools and technology, of having processes, of training project managers properly, very much went by the wayside and was really viewed as a luxury. So these are pretty significant challenges from an organizational standpoint that can bring down the idea of improving project management within an organization. Governance effectiveness is a real big one we see. I think governance is a very misunderstood term. It's used a lot, but I think it's not embraced very well. And so the idea that there's a governance process can be a challenge itself. We see a lot of organizations defining project management process, but not necessarily the accompanying governance processes to say, well, what's going to make this project management process not optional? How do we manage the change to the organization? So typically, a lack of a governance process is linked to an overall inadequacy of a portfolio management process. Our philosophy here at Project Assistance is that portfolio management includes governance. It's not just the typical how do we bring ideas on and how do we put dimensions around those ideas, those requests for projects, how do we compare and contrast those ideas and choose the most optimal mix in the portfolio. But at some point, the projects in the portfolio actually have to be performed. And while there may be project management process to drive the performance of those projects to on time, on budget, on spec completion, the responsibilities of the governing bodies, the steering committees, the executives that are approving the project budgets, oftentimes there really is a lack of process. And by the way, just like there's a reluctance to invest in project management, or it can be viewed as a luxury, we see a mirror challenge on the governance side of the house. Right? So the reluctance of the business sponsors to support an investment in governance that translates into the fact that if we say we're going to do governance, it means we're going to do something that we may not have been doing up to this point. If we haven't been doing up to this point and we're going to start doing it, who's going to do it? If somebody's got to do it, then we've got to invest in it. And the other very natural resistance is this, what I call homogenizing the ideation process. Right? So if we think about what do we mean by homogenizing, well, if you go back to the original term for homogenizing, it's making things uniform, if you will. It's taking things and making them very vanilla. So ideation is the idea of how we generate ideas, how we have innovative suggestions, and there's a resistance to putting portfolio governance processes in place because that creative part of the organization can feel like it's in a straitjacket, can feel like it's hamstrung, can feel like it's being homogenized. So there can be a feeling that we've done projects in the past based on expert judgment. You know, we've had a very go with the flow mentality, and we've been good at that. And we're concerned that if we start bringing governance and portfolio management to the table, that we will somehow hamper the process. And if done poorly, in fact, that's what will happen. And innovation will be challenged if we don't do this well. One of the biggest challenges we see, more at the execution level, is this idea of knowledge and bandwidth. You know, do our project managers have both the ability and the availability to take what's currently happening in the organization, and as we move into some kind of desired future state, how do we get those project managers to have the bandwidth necessary, to have the availability necessary to embrace new process? And even if we make that bandwidth available, the accompanying question to that is, do the project managers have the experience to harness the power of the process? Have they done this before? Are we putting processes out there that are beyond the maturity of the project managers? And so, again, going back to this idea of assessing project management maturity, yeah, important, but more importantly, what's that realistic approach to really get the bandwidth available and to get the experience available so that we don't have what's in the bottom left-hand circle, which is this ad hoc process. You know, we have, any organization that has any size of projects is likely to have some experienced project managers. And so lacking the standards and the infrastructure from a central standpoint for how we're going to do project management more effectively, we'll get a broad range of ad hoc processes. We'll get tools out there, but oh, by the way, they're not integrated because they haven't been centralized. We'll see project manager experience, but we'll see a broad range of that, and lacking a standard of what that project management experience should be, that lack of appropriate knowledge will remain embedded in the organization. So before we go into the project management methodologies, just wanted to conduct a brief poll. You should see coming up on your screen a poll. And if you could just click and answer, we're going to give about 30 seconds once we launch the poll. And the question is, has your organization completed a project management maturity assessment? And so I see lots of people responding. Looks like number 3 is not very popular. Don't have any in progress yet. So if anybody's out there with an in progress assessment, let us know. So we're at about 30 seconds. I'm going to give this about another 15 seconds. And thanks everybody for your feedback. So before we move to the next slide, I'll go ahead and I'll share those results. And so thanks to everybody who responded. For those of you who are looking on the screen, we've got, that's a pretty high number, 25% have actually done a project management maturity assessment. 44% haven't, and 31% don't know. And if you're a project manager, I guess that's okay. We've certainly seen assessments that go on that don't poll every project manager. Assessments are done at the organizational level. Sometimes there are samples of project managers. I'd like to think if you're a project manager and your organization has done one that you would know about it, but that doesn't mean they told you. So thanks everybody for participating in the poll. So what we want to talk about now is the current state of project management maturity methodologies. It says hide results to resume screen share. Let me just go ahead and do that. I'm not able to hide the poll. You able to do that, Jan? Can you see my screen? Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'd like to go through a project management methodology inventory, if you will, and just a flyby of samplings of what's out there. For those of you who have seen assessments, or those of you who are interested in assessments, we want to just talk a little bit about what's out there. And the first one we'll talk about is the PPM maturity model. So Gartner, if you're not familiar with Gartner, industry analyst, a lot of work in the IT area, but certainly a lot of wisdom around the state of portfolio and project management. So we see this PPM, portfolio and project management maturity model. And they evaluate things like the culture of the organization. There is an ability to evaluate individual capabilities and also organization process maturity. And they have 6 levels. It runs from non-existent to fully mature. So that's one sample that you may or may not have heard of. If you're interested in more around this model, there's a lot of content out there that you can see, and there's a lot of additional content that you can get access to if you're a subscriber, or if your organization is a subscriber to the Gartner PPM content. The one that I would say probably most people in the world of project management have heard of, if you've heard of any, would probably be the OPM3, the M3 standing for Maturity Model Assessment, so Organizational Project Management Maturity Assessment. And it was really developed, you can see in the quotes here, it was developed to provide, to what PMI says, to provide a way for organizations to better understand their project management capabilities and to measure their maturity or stage of process development against best practices. For those of you who have seen this, one of the things PMI has done, which is neat, is create a database so that you can benchmark yourself by industry. You can compare yourself to other aspects of what's in the database. The third one, CMM, while this is not a project management maturity model, for those of you who are in the software development world, if you've seen PMI's 5 levels of maturity, or the original Kerzner publication on the subject of project management maturity model, very much borrowed from the Software Engineering Institute's capability maturity model from the field of software development. And not surprisingly, in order to be good at any methodology that creates project deliverables, the capability maturity model, which is also referred to as CMMI, has 5 levels, and not surprisingly references the importance of project management. The fourth one I'd like to cover is the Corporate Executive Board. The Corporate Executive Board is a research body and a content provider around many, many topics of interest, again, primarily to the information technology world, but they have this project management diagnostic, and they talk a lot about how you define and build components of a PMO. So there's the ability to do benefits tracking and value reporting. For those of you familiar with high-level portfolio management, project management, at the end of a portfolio usually comes this question of, did we get what we thought we were going to get when we invested in this project? So the idea of benefits tracking and value reporting is becoming more and more popular as an end goal for why we would invest in portfolio and project management. So if we can tell senior management you're investing in the right projects and you're getting a return on that investment, we have a better chance of selling the benefits of doing PPM more effectively. And there's more information there, end-to-end stakeholder management, project and program management methodology, etc. Prince 2, outside of the U.S. and specifically in the U.K., there is a, if you're familiar with PMI's project management body of knowledge, I would call Prince 2 the rough equivalent in the U.K. of a project management methodology, but also has key components of how you would assess the maturity against a methodology like that. And there's many other organizations out there that do it. Not surprisingly, I'll use Project Assistance as an example. I'm not going to go through any great level of detail here, but we use the PMI 5 levels of project management maturity assessment, and we have, as I'll show you a couple slides from now, an experience-based model that looks at typical progression through maturity such that plans can be built that make sense, that really help evolve, I'll say, appropriately to the next level. So one of the things that happens is, you know, there's one of the disconnects actually out there, or one of the expectations that organizations have that I didn't cover under the organization expectation gap, but I think is worth mentioning here is what we expect from these methodologies. You know, a lot of the methodologies out there deliver what they say they're going to deliver, but if your organization expects something other than what it delivers, you have a built-in disconnect. So for example, one of the perceived shortcomings of project management maturity methodologies can be we expected this to cover more than project management. You know, if we're assessing project management, shouldn't we we'd be looking at what I call life cycle management? And what I mean by life cycle management is depending on which kind of projects you're managing, they have different life cycles. Software developments have software development life cycle. Drug development has, at least in the U.S., the FDA standards for phasing and approval and getting drugs in the marketplace. We see construction-related methodologies. We certainly see engineering-related methodologies. We can be specific in the engineering area about how we build aircraft, how we build aerospace and defense kinds of applications. So we often see in a methodology, if we're assessing an organization, what we often see is a very, I'll say, not inappropriate, but not on purpose either, integration of life cycle and project management methodologies, making it difficult to assess just the project management maturity when, in fact, what an organization oftentimes is looking for is an assessment of how we do projects, and to separate project management away from the actual building of the deliverables, the software, the drugs, the aircraft, the buildings that are coming out of our projects can be extremely difficult. So we see a real desire, legitimate desire of organizations to get beyond project management, not only for life cycle, but how's our governance process going? What's our ability to embrace change? Do we have processes that enable that? Do we have governing bodies that govern well? And even next level up from just the plain governance is the portfolio management process itself. And so what we really are looking for usually is a broader, when I say we, I mean organizations like yours are looking for is a broader methodology that looks at all those dimensions and provides a means to define the current state and the future state. Some objective way to talk about what do we mean if we have a scoring system of 1 to 6 or 1 to 4 or 1 to 5. What does it mean to be a 3? And then not only that, but some way of thinking about the potential gaps, not only in the methodologies themselves, but in the organizations that we assess. So I call this the Goldilocks challenge. There's this question of how do we get from where we are now to where we're trying to get to? How do we progress from the current state to the desired future state? And I call this the Goldilocks challenge because in every situation there's this question of, if you recall Goldilocks and what her challenge was when she got into the beds, one was too hard and one was too soft and one was just right. When we got to the porridge, one was too hot and one was too cold and one was just right. And it's really that search for what Goldilocks was looking for was the question of what's just right for us. And there's not necessarily, we certainly haven't seen a one-size-fits-all for what's right for an organization. So the real challenge is in the chaos and in the battle of an organization that has real projects going on and has a desire to get better, we're really looking at another analogy I use, which is really changing the wing on the airplane without landing. How do we do that? What's the appropriate way to approach from where we are now to where we're trying to get to, not go too far too fast, not impose too much of a burden on the projects that are in flight, not to do too much process, not to do too much technology, not to ask our project managers to do too much, not to create too much of not only a process challenge for our project managers, as I had back on the challenge slide, but an availability challenge. So it's really tough to find a methodology that says, well, here's where you ought to go with this. In your situation, here's what Goldilocks looks like for you. And the planning advice that defines the improvement methodology. What is an improvement methodology? If there's a methodology for building spacecraft, if there's a methodology for bringing drugs to market, if there's a methodology for putting up 45-story buildings, if there's a methodology for building software, I guess there should be a methodology for how we get better at portfolio and project management. And the question is, how do I build that? What does that prescribed work breakdown structure look like? What should I do? So and closely related to that is just what's the methodology to define a specific scope and charter for the improvement initiative? How do we do that? How do we take an organization and say, okay, as a matter of fact, it's interesting when we talk to our customers and we say, we're going to assess your current state, they say things like, we know we're a zero. Can we move on? We know we're somewhat dysfunctional as a project management family. Let's get beyond that. And let's get to where we're trying to get to. And because the gap is wide, how can we get to some realistic Goldilocks level of planning that brings us the just right level of project management and portfolio management and life cycle management and governance? And oh, by the way, don't make it too hot or too cold. And that's a big challenge. It's a big, big challenge. So the what now part of this presentation is really this idea of, how do we know where we're going? It's not uncommon at all for us to see a PMO without a plan, right? So as you may recall, this quote that you see here from Lewis Carroll is the question. This is the answer, but the question that Alice was asking to the Cheshire Cat up in the tree is, which road should I take? And the Cheshire Cat asked the question, well, where would you like to go? And she said, I don't know where I want to go. And the Cheshire Cat said, well, if you don't know where you're going, then any road will take you there. And that is really the crux of the challenge that we want to talk about today for the next 15 minutes. So getting beyond the assessment is really thinking about what's a realistic process for evolving from the current state to the future state. Okay, we know we're at some level that's less than ideal in our maturity level, our current state. We know there's some desired future state out there that, as we talked about in the organizational challenges, if you think about that, the desired future state is surrounded by what we see back on slide 8. Right, so we want to go to some future state with unclear expectations, unclear sponsorship, misaligned expectations, a lack of commitment to investment. It's a luxury. We want to do the unrealistic. We want you to get to nirvana, level 5, level 6, level 4, depending on the organization assessment you're using. And by the way, we've got expectations, and we just want you to be really good at this. And so that whole challenge really plays back into this idea of how do we evolve to a future state. And how do we get clarity around all that unclarity that we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation? And clearly, this idea that the current state and the definition of the future state oftentimes is challenged by a desire of the organization not to limit this to project management. How do we bring in the life cycle management, the portfolio management, 2 others I didn't mention, resource management, change management maturity. Some assess that, some don't, so I throw it out there as additional dimensions to think about depending on the assessment you may or may not be using. And by the way, this slide 18 is not one necessary to read every word on the page, but it's to get a concept across. What you see up top is knowledge management, or what I'm referring to today is life cycle management. So let that dimension. Let's think about, in this case, this is PMI's levels of initial ad hoc versus developing level 2 versus defined level 3 versus managed level 4 versus optimized level 5. This idea of how do we move across those dimensions? And how do we break this thing down to some manageable bite-sized set of where are we now, where are we going to get to kind of questions and answers? So we see knowledge management as an example. We see another 4 of the 9 PMBOK areas: integration management, scope management, time management, cost management. And so if we say your current state is a 1 in knowledge management, a 2 in scope management, and a 3 and a 1 in time management, we should be able to make statements like what's in those boxes. Now, I'll expand the time management dimension in a moment, but just conceptually, the idea of a current state being objective, being prescriptive in terms of describing what the current state is. You're a 2 because this is what a 2 sounds like. And oh, by the way, if you're trying to become a 4, or in this case, move from a 1 to a 2 in life cycle management or knowledge management, move from a 2 to a 3 in scope management, here's the kind of progression you can expect. If you ask to go to a 5, we'll say, how does 2 look? If you're a 1, how does a 2 look? If you're going from 2 to 5, how does it look to go to 3 and 4 first? So this idea of how do I bring some order to the chaos starts looking like saying, how do I peel off some of these, not all of these? And oh, by the way, which of these do I peel off first? Do I do scope management before I do time management? Do I do life cycle management before I do risk management? These are important questions, and the answers can be very unique depending on the situation within an organization. And what you see here from the colors are, we can call this a phase, we can call it a priority, we can even call it a milestone. We can have a second quarter 2011 milestone, and we're going to make them, let's say, the green progressions. Okay, and we can make the yellows be fourth quarter of 2011, and we can make those the yellow progressions. And when we get out to the greens, we can make those. I'm sorry, the light greens, which you didn't see yet. We can make those the phase 3, priority 3, or maybe first quarter of 2012 kind of progressions. So this idea of saying there's going to be some order to the chaos by some definition that's objective of current state, some definition that's objective of future state. What's the gap? How do we close it? What's the plan? So we can begin to see some kind of a plan come out of this. So for example, if we were exploding the bands for time management, one of my favorite and one that's hard not to do at some point to get good at project management, so I like to use it because it's popular. We see progressions from no formal time estimating techniques. Plans are not status for labor, cost, or schedule. So yeah, we want to get on time, on budget, but we're not keeping our plans up to date. And baselining, the idea of snapping a picture, just like we talked about the organization, taking a baseline for improvement. How about the idea of taking a baseline of my schedule, my labor estimates, my dollar budgets, so that I can have something to compare to as the project progresses. So if they're not happening, it makes it hard to get good at it, doesn't it? What we see a lot of times is the higher visibility projects will begin to see some level of estimating techniques, maybe spreadsheets, maybe previous experience. We'll usually see projects being status for schedule first before we see labor or cost. Oftentimes, even though the schedules are updated, it's against the lack of a baseline, so we don't know what the variances are. We start to see some progress in level 3. A lot of times, customers are asking to go to 3 or 4. Organizations are asking you to get to 3 or 4. So let's talk about 3. Time or labor status is introduced. The critical path is defined. Some baselining is being applied. We want to know where we're off schedule, so we're going to start asking you to keep track of that. And oh, by the way, if you're going to change the schedule, we're going to have some level of change control for how we do those revisions. And even if we are tracking labor, if we're collecting actuals or we're collecting costs, usually that's done just at the project summary level. And a lot of organizations start off saying, you know, we want to do number 4. They don't call it number 4, but they'll speak in terms like to say, we would like to improve our estimating process. We'd like to perform earned value analysis. We would like our projects to be formally baselined to enable effective measurement of variances. And we would like labor tracking to work breakdown structure level of detail. Well, hip, hip, hooray, good place to get to. But where are you today? How far are you from a level 4? How much would you have to progress to get there? What would be the plan to close that gap? And of course, when I talked about benefits analysis, one of the things that people get into with benefits analysis from projects is some ability to look at how long things typically take us. There's a benefit of doing project management well because we can do it better the next time if we learn from our lessons. So just an example. And why am I using this example? Because really, the idea of a maturity assessment really comes in what I would call column 1. Okay, we have a 3-phase solution approach. Most of what we're asked to do comes in what I call column 2. What I also affectionately call implement stuff. Okay, implement stuff like training, implement stuff like process, implement stuff like project management technology. But a lot of those initiatives really start with implement stuff and don't really take a step back and say, what are we ready for? What kind of process are we ready for? What kind of project management capabilities does the organization have? What kind of technology are we ready to embrace? So we don't just go out there and buy an F-16 and why we can't fly them without fighter pilots and fuel facilities and air traffic controls and runways. So the idea for today is the what now isn't so much the assessment. Right? If we look back at the title of today's webinar, it's I've done an assessment, what now? Right? And the what now is how do we do the implement stuff? What is that maturity level we're going to try to land on so that when we go out and we do specifications for process, specifications for technology, specifications for training we're going to offer to our project managers, and we develop those things and we install them and configure them and implement them and train and roll out, what is that cast against? And most importantly, what I want to talk about is, as we come down to the next concept here, is this idea that governance, that adoption and governance against execution of a project management process is equally important to the project management processes themselves. So what do we mean by that? I'm just going to expand column number 3. Having talked about column number 1, the assessment methodology itself is really what I just went through conceptually in those previous slides where we looked at column 1, column 2, column 3, I'm sorry, level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5. That's the whole assessment process. But what I really want to talk about for a moment is the what now of how do we get to the adoption and governance. So there's really 2 answers in my mind to the what now. The what now is I have a current state, I have a desired future state. How do I close the gap? Right? What's the plan to close the gap, number 1? And then number 2, how do I in fact formally execute a plan to make change happen? And so we call that adoption and governance. And really, the phase 1 idea here, developing order from chaos, what I affectionately called a few slides ago, the project, this idea that there be a plan, that there be a scope, that there be a charter. Okay, so just like any other project out there, if we're going to have a project be effective, one of the things that makes it really effective, or if I can use the reverse of that, one of the things that makes projects very ineffective is scope creep. Almost every organization we go into that has a challenge around project management has some kind of problem with scope creep. So the idea that we would have a charter for an initiative to improve project management out of phase 1, what we suggest is that there be a charter that has the normal things you would have in a charter. Why are we doing it? How long is it going to take? Who's going to be involved? What are we going to deliver? What are the outcomes going to be? So they look like sections of a charter or a scope document. What are the objectives? What's the approach? What's the project manager availability? What's the governance? What's the schedule? What are the key milestones? Really, conceptually, what I showed you in the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, or priority 1, priority 2, priority 3, or quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, are really those schedules and key milestones. The roles and responsibilities, who's involved, how do we get clarity around expectations, what's the organization looking for, what are we going to commit to this thing, oh, by the way, there's an investment, so what's the cost? So the idea of saying, well, hey, if we're going to get good at project management, let's treat it like a project. Let's do the project well. But then springing off of that, as we go through the implementation, assuming we have a plan, assuming we implement tools, technology, process, and capabilities of project managers, this idea that with the goal of an on-time, on-budget, on-spec delivery, what does a governance process look like? So typically a governance process does a good job of integrating project management process, project management technology, project management training, and project manager capabilities. Coaching and mentoring is a process. It's not an event. It's something that's ongoing. It's something that requires investment ongoing. Process adoption and audit. What do we do to go out there as a process and audit the projects to see if they're following and being governed and doing what they said they were going to do. If I give you money for singing lessons, can you sing? Are you going to do the lessons? Are you doing what lesson 1 told you to do? Are you moving on to lesson 2? The idea of reporting and escalating. So if we go through a process adoption audit and we see that things aren't being adopted, and oh, by the way, that means the project's in trouble, how do we report around that? Well, how do we escalate? And then ultimately, what's the innovation and corrective action? And primarily that when I said coaching and mentoring is not an event, there's something like ongoing support. How do we help our project managers to be effective over time? And so what does that look like? Well, a plan for change is what it looks like. And what it means is the chart is not just about how we get good at project management, it's how we change the world to make project management better in an organization. So for the last couple of minutes here, I just want to spend just a couple of slides talking about what we mean by, so what we mean by governance process is it's a process, so it has inputs and outputs and transforming steps. It has things like frequencies. It has the other kinds of attributes you might expect to have for certain kinds of projects, certain size, certain duration, how many locations, whatever your methodology would be for sizing a project would define what kind of governance that project should require. How do we execute the process? Well, we do those things we just talked about. What the process is a process for reviewing projects, for auditing, and I put capital support in capital letters because that's really what it should be. I hate to use the word audit because a good process for governance will support project managers. It will help them. Okay, so when we evaluate, we link them to the outputs of the tactical plan. The tactical plan I just talked about says the project says what maturity level we're going to land on. So if the maturity level is we're going to be level 3 and we're going to track actuals at the project level, then we're going to go ahead and make sure that when we do the evaluations, that those evaluations are bringing us to a level 3 of maturity. Reporting, I'll get into that in a moment, but the idea that formal reports come out of projects, that there are metrics, that there are measurements that we can standardize on, and then also there's follow-up from the output. And then the final thing, continuous improvement. So reporting from the governance process. You see red, yellow, green. I have an A, B, C, D, F here. It's not unintentional that we have that. So an A is an A, as you've known an A your whole life. No known issues, projects under control. I'm not going to get into the definition of control. There is a formal, standard, objective definition of control, not an opinion. On time, on budget, on spec, but with known issues, with an action plan in place to mitigate risk, so something bad could be coming down the pipe. A C might be something like it's not on time, on budget, but there's a plan to get it back on track. A D might be it's not on time, on budget, on spec. There's no plan to get it back on track. There's a risk of failure. And an F is it's failing, and maybe we want to cancel it now. And again, closely related to that is this idea of, so what if, depending on the grade, what would we do? You know, if it's an A, we keep it on a regular governance reporting cycle. If it's B, it's regular, but reporting gets escalated of issues. If it's a C, maybe we increase the frequency. Maybe the owning executive attends the status reviews and asks questions. If it's a D, maybe there's a problem with the project manager. Maybe we need to escalate to a steering committee, greater executive presence, all those things. We've seen all these things in real projects. It's really the idea of formalizing it. And then one of the ways we know if these things are formalized, I can ask an organization, one of the first questions I can ask is, do you have a formal process for canceling projects? If the answer is no, I would suggest that there's room for improvement in governance. A good governance process, in fact, will cancel projects. And finally, before we go to the question and answer section for today, this idea of measuring effectiveness. One of the challenges I mentioned early on in our presentation today was this challenge around how do we know if we're getting better or not? How do we know, what the current state was back when I first started doing this? So back on slide 7, the last bullet was no measurement of current state available to create a baseline for improvement. So there's some assumption here that if I'm going to measure effectiveness, that I'm willing to take some sort of measurements about the current state before I try to measure the future state. Okay, so what does that mean? Quite simply, it means that moving to a higher stage, I had an executive ask me a good question. Why would we do this? You're talking about moving from a 2 to a 3 or a 2 to a 5, so what? Why would I do it? And the answer really is the 3 bullets you see down there. Like, projects will finish sooner than they would have before. Cost overruns will be reduced or eliminated, closely related to that. Cost overrun is overallocation of resources, which is why cost overruns occur, or projects finishing sooner when schedules run late, that causes overages. And ineffective projects canceled, meaning we have more effective use of portfolio funding. We stop sending good money after bad, and we start sending that money to better places. So that's the main gist of our presentation today. What I'd like to spend the next couple of minutes doing is just setting up for some questions and answers. Before I do that, not surprisingly to you, Project Assistance does consulting in this area. We provide innovative solutions which ensure flawless execution of organizational strategy, typically in a project-intensive environment. I like to call strategy a plan for change. How do we change things in an organization? We usually do it through projects. Right, so a flawless execution of organizational strategy is really what project management is in an organization that has to do projects. So how do we do that? We reduce the risk of these initiatives, maximize the ROI, speed the realization of value, so get something in the early phases. When we talk about the early phases of a tactical plan, let's get something out of it, and to actually change the organization effectively. And I'm just going to put this slide up here quickly because I want to move to the questions and answers. These are the practices the project manager, the Microsoft Project, Project Assistance has. So I want to highlight the solutions, the top blue box, and I want to highlight the application development and training on the bottom right, and the green box to the left, project and portfolio staffing. So we also supply project managers. And next steps. If you're interested in what we talked about today, please contact us. Jan's contact information will be up at the end, our coordinator for today, who I'm about to turn this back over to. But we've done some of these complimentary PPM maturity improvement readiness briefings. They do help PMOs get justified for improvement initiatives. They do help get funding. We have proof, and we can talk about that if you'd like to talk about it. And what do we review? What are your capabilities from a process standpoint? What's your future state? A lot of trouble out there, common challenges. They'll conceive the last three bullets. They'll conceive technology deployments, and they have a harmful effect on these initiatives. Big investments in project management technology get blamed for organizations that don't follow an improvement methodology. So this process we talked about today can help remove some of those harmful effects. The common training and competency development shortcomings, this brings that into context. And then, of course, the appropriate methodology and guidance, which is what we talked about towards the end there, the project. The webinar itself will be captured today, will be posted on the website typically within the next 24 hours. I mentioned that here because if you don't have the ability to grab Jan's contact information, certainly you can replay the webinar or at least grab the phone number and give us a call. And before I open the floor for questions and answers, I wanted to acknowledge, am I doing this part, Jan? Okay, thanks. I wanted to acknowledge some of the questions, I shouldn't say some of the questions, some of the feedback we got during the registration process. Our registration process has been enhanced to ask folks as they register what areas of interest they have. And so these are the areas of interest, and I bring this up because, A, to thank the people who took the time to tell us what they're interested in. That certainly influenced what we did in the presentation. And B, that if you feel that that there was something you would like to have seen covered today that we didn't, this is an okay time to answer that question. And so what I'll do is I'm going to turn it over to Jan at this point for questions and answers. Jan?
At this point, I'd like to invite you to use your webinar console to submit any questions you might have. And we're going to start with a few that I've been receiving throughout the presentation. Gus, here's the first one. What percentage of project management improvement initiatives begin with an assessment?
Okay, so I'm going to restate the question. Which percentage of implementations begin with an assessment? So I'll go back to I'm going to bring a slide up. I'm going to say slide 19 here to answer that question. Nope, I'm out of whack here. I added the slide. So which percentage of, I'll restate this to say, which percentage of projects did we see in column 2 that actually had a column 1 to start? In other words, I called that implement stuff column 2. So rough guess, I would say certainly less than 25%. Now, I need to be careful to qualify that. I would say if I use the definition of a formal assessment, it's definitely less than 25% of the ones that we run across, and certainly probably closer to 10%. And I think that answers the question. What's the correlation between initiatives that start with an assessment and what? And the success of the initiatives. So there's a part 2 there. Oh, I'm sorry. Thanks, Jan. You want to read the second question? I'm sorry.
Sure. What's the correlation between initiatives that start with a project management maturity assessment and the success of those initiatives?
Okay, so the first question was what percentage have an assessment? The second question is there a correlation? Okay, so that's a good follow-on question. Is there a correlation between initiatives that start with an assessment and the success of the initiatives? Most definitely, and I would qualify that a little bit. And by the way, I'm going to stay on the same slide. I would qualify that a little bit to say not only is there a correlation between the assessment and the success of column 2, but really we've seen where 1 and 2 go well, but 3 doesn't. Okay, so there's a high correlation between A, having a plan, B, executing that plan, which is column 2, and 3, actually following up and making sure that the plan sticks. And so what's the correlation? I would say it's very high. I'd be willing to say we guarantee it, as a matter of fact. I wasn't prepared to say that. Mark, I don't know if you're on the line. I hope you didn't just have a heart attack when I said that. But I would say that everyone we've been involved in that did a good assessment, that had a good plan, that did the follow-up on the adoption and governance, had strong success, A, and B, back to question 1, was a lower percentage, unfortunately, of the ones we're involved in. Any other questions, Jan?
That's it. That's all I have.
Okay, well, thanks, everybody. I'll give 3 minutes back on your afternoon today. I have 3:57. Thank you all for your time and attendance today, and we'll hope to see you in the future.